Hi, welcome. My name is Joanna, and today I'll be discussing House of Chains, Book 4 in MALAZAN Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. I'm a fairly new booktuber, so I don't have videos on the first 3 books in this series, but if you're interested in learning more about my experience so far, I do have a video called My MALAZAN Journey So Far, and it's spoiler-free, so please feel free to watch it if you're curious. I'll leave a link to the video in the description. This in no way will be the most detailed or comprehensive analysis on House of Chains. I'm just going to provide some of my impressions, overall thoughts, the basic structure of the book, and some themes and sub-themes as I saw them throughout the book. First of all, I loved this book. This book was so powerful for me. I understand that this is considered a lot of people's least favorite or low on the ranking list of favorite MALAZAN books in the series. However, I didn't feel that way at all. It just completely carried me from beginning to end. It's been about a week now since I read the book, and I'm still processing it. I'm still thinking about it, and I'm still emotional over it. So this book definitely left a very strong impact on me. The overall structure of the book is very different than previous books. Unlike the first 3 books in MALAZAN, this one follows one main POV for the first big chunk of it, who is Karsa Orlong, and it follows Karsa quite a bit throughout the rest of the book as well. We do get introduced at one point, though, to the MALAZANs in Aran, to Shaik and her rebellion in Raraku, and some other characters such as Kalam and Troll Onrik, Absalar, Cutter. We even get some encounters with Iskaral Pust, his wife, as well as Mappo and Icarium. Starting off with Karsa, Karsa has such an interesting journey in this book. I'm going to go into more detail about him when I discuss the themes of the book, but just to start off, I was very shaken at the beginning when this character comes out with his tribesmen. He's very, very arrogant and headstrong. He makes vows every single page, and he goes around raping and murdering like it's nothing. When I saw how violent he was, my first thought was, okay, this is probably the makings of a redemption arc. But then I questioned that because this is Steven Erikson, and I'm thinking Steven Erikson is not going to do anything quite so obvious or straightforward. And I was right to question that because he definitely didn't. Karsa was very complicated, and I don't think he became less complicated by the end, though he definitely did go through a big transformation. What was fascinating for me about that transformation was his encounter with Torvald Nom, who I believe is related to Ralik Nom. After Karsa rapes and murders and talks down to his tribesmen, and his tribesmen get killed, he is taken as prisoner and treated pretty horrifically. He goes in and out of consciousness and is very, very wounded, but meanwhile, Torvald Nom keeps his spirit alive by talking to him. And I think that really did make an impact on Karsa in a heart sense, in a spirit sense. Karsa actually gives Torvald Nom a heartfelt goodbye when they part ways and talk about meeting again eventually. The pairing between Torvald and Karsa was one of many interesting pairings of friendships throughout this book that I absolutely loved. Another one of those that was my favorite actually was Temel and Strings or Fiddler. In fact, after this book, I think that Strings Fiddler might be one of my favorite characters of all time. I loved him so much in this book. But the particular scene that I'm thinking about is the scene in which Fiddler just learned that Whiskey Jack died in Genebacchus with some of the other bridge burners. And he's mourning that. He's grieving that. He doesn't even get very much time to process that when Temel comes along. And Temel discusses kind of a number of things. Temel is grieving for himself, as he explains, because he has to take on this role as war leader after Coltane's death. Editing Joanna, I just wanted to add a little bit more context to that scene. Temel discusses how he honors Coltane because he must. Coltane, though, did what he was expected to do. But Duiker was old and fought even though he wasn't expected to. Although Coltane's body was eaten by the crows came for his soul and he was reborn. Temel was never worried about his soul, that it would ever be lost, which was the purpose of a saving stone that Duiker wore around his neck. but Duiker's body disappeared and Temel kept his horse for him. Fiddler points out that Duiker looked to him, to Temel, not just to Nillanether, and that was very meaningful for Temel in that scene. Temel going through all of this stress, taking all of this in, processing all of this, and having to live up to being a leader like Coltane and step into some very big shoes for the Crow clan. It was just so beautiful the way that Whiskey Jack responded to Temel. He seemed to elevate Temel, to build him up, to empathize with him and build him up at the same time. And that was just coming right after grieving Whiskey Jack's death. It was such an amazing encounter and amazing moment because these two are from totally different backgrounds. I don't know what it was about that interaction, but it meant so much to me. It spoke to me in such a heartfelt way that I actually cried quite a bit after reading that passage. It might be kind of strange to some people in the grander scheme of other things that are very heartbreaking in this book, but that was a scene that just completely broke my heart and was just so beautiful in so many ways. Now I'm going to discuss some of the themes as I saw them in the book. The overarching theme, of course, being House of Chains, which is part of the Deck of Dragons, as well as Karsa's journey, carrying all of his spirits of the people he killed along with him. But I also saw this playing out in various other ways, which I think is evident in many instances in the book. The way that I broke it down in my mind was our relationship to the ancestral past, whether we deny the ancestral past or change it, identity, bloodlines, and betrayal. And with betrayal, vengeance as an answer to betrayal. Those two seem to go very hand in hand, especially in this book. Starting off with the ancestral past, Karsa and Byroth have a conversation very early on in the book in which Byroth tells Karsa that the elders lie. There's this whole conversation there that happens about denying the past, about changing it, and this doesn't sit very well with Karsa. It doesn't go along with his image or identity of how he sees the tribe. He doesn't seem to agree with this, but it's an interesting aspect of the Templar culture, which seems to be a tradition that they carry on. Another encounter with the relationship with the past might be seen in the glyphs in the cave when Byroth and Delum and Karsa read these laws of isolation that are written there, and they speak of clearing the blood and strengthening the children. To survive, we must forget. So there's this talk again about forgetting the past or cutting ties with the past in order to cleanse the bloodline, isolate the tribe. There's even some talk about rape as a means to continue this tradition, which is very questionable. I also really liked how there's this whole section of the book when Karsa is questioning the Seven and questioning godhood. In that section, Sibal talks to him about a number of things, about this whole concept of imperfection, but also about failure, and to fail is to reveal a flaw. You face that revelation, do not turn your back on it, do not make it empty vows, to never repeat your mistakes. Interesting thing to say to Karsa because he makes vows like all the time. But I thought it was interesting just to see, again, how she's relating to the past in that moment through accepting the past rather than trying to cut off from it, to face it and to learn from it and to accept that failure is a real thing. Sibal, of course, has sworn fealty to the crippled god, and many children were sacrificed for her. Karsa doesn't see this as an act of mercy or compassion. He questions these things. So I think that attribute of Karsa is maybe a positive one. But it is a little questionable how he deals with that, his concept of mercy throwing Sibal away at the end. But that does point to cutting ties with the past or the way things should be, or trying to go along with what others say he should do or how he should be. I found that just an interesting exploration again about relating to the ancestral past or gods or way of being. In that way, Karsa is definitely an interesting exploration on identity and bloodlines. In this story, he also questions his grandfather and father. He describes his grandfather as being a conservative conformist, and he thinks of his father as being an indifferent coward. Neither path really resonate with him. He says blindness exists on both sides. So Karsa, throughout this book, is just kind of trying to carve his own path. At the same time, at the very end, he still calls himself Karsa, the Tebor. So I don't think he denies his past as much as he just isn't willing to accept that it has to define him from then on. He doesn't even accept the definition of being the knight in the House of Chains. Through Karsa's story, I transitioned from the theme of relationships with the ancestral past, denying or accepting the past, into identity. Another exploration of identity was through Cutter or Crocus, and he was very interesting because he, of course, changes his name to Cutter and takes on this role of being an assassin and working with Cotillion. And he seems to do this because he thinks that this is what Absalar wants, or this would make him greater in some way, which has the absolute opposite effect. Absalar seems to be almost offended that Cutter does this, that Crocus turns towards Cotillion and towards being an assassin. And I think part of this was because Absalar never wanted Cotillion to possess her. She never wanted that role. She never wanted to be an assassin. And then she's left questioning, well, did Cutter, Crocus, love the real me? Or did he really love Cotillion all along? Because that's who I was when I was an assassin. I wasn't really Absalar. Who is Absalar and who does he love? I loved the conversation between Absalar and Cotillion, where he explains to her that Crocus loves the real her, that he fell in love with her after Cotillion left her body. He explains that there are multitudes in Absalar and that Crocus loves all of them. I loved that so much. That was such a beautiful, beautiful conversation. It's funny because I didn't know what to think of Cotillion, and at that point I thought, well, I kind of like Cotillion now. I don't know if I'm supposed to, but that's Malazan for you. I also loved the interaction between Absalar and Crocus Cutter because they're young, and Crocus is just assuming he's being what the other wants. And so many times when we're young, we work so hard to try to be what we think other people want us to be, or how other people want us to be, when really they just want us to be ourselves all along, and they want to be loved for being themselves, not for that image or ideal. Gamut was another interesting exploration on identity. I loved Gamut's character because I just love military life. I find it very fascinating anytime we go into tactics and strategy, that kind of thing. Gamut starts off in this book in his administrative role as Fist, and he seems to really resist that. He's an older soldier. He seems to equate significance and usefulness with being in the action, with being in the battle, and he doesn't seem to accept that he can be worth value as a Fist. I love the conversation between Gamut and Blistic, when Blistic basically tells Gamut, no, you are worthless to us if you're out there getting wounded and not helping us. You serve a valuable role as Fist. Gamut, of course, responds to this by punching Blistic. Gamut pays some consequences for jumping into battle, and he seems to just hate himself even more when he doesn't succeed, when he gets injured. It was interesting at the end, though, how he ended up living his dream of being a glorious war hero after dying. Related to identity is a scene in which Shaik or Felison was discussing with Aloric how everyone in their camp could be seen as an orphan, with the exception of Leomin, Bidithal, Corvalodam, Heberic. She says, we were children of the Malazan Empire once, and what have we done? We cast off the Empress in exchange for an insane goddess who dreams only of destruction, who seeks to feed on a sea of blood. Another interesting exploration of identity was through the characters of Shaik/Felison and Tavor. Tavor, I understand, is not an easy character to get into. We never see her POV, we never see inside her mind, but I think she shows her struggles in her own way. She's constantly having to prove herself as adjunct. She goes through so much trouble getting to Rariku and killing her sister without even realizing she's killing Felison. And after all of that, someone raises the Crow clan standard. Nil and Nether run up to her and let her know that the legions of Wiccan ghosts took care of the Dog Slayers and other enemies. They let her know that she didn't drag the chain of dogs with her. It seems like they're trying to tell her this to console her. Oh, you didn't drag the chain of dogs. The ghosts, they came up. And it's kind of funny to me because it's like they're trying to make her feel better about this, but at the same time, it could be seen as like, well, you didn't really do anything. You didn't really help anybody here. You just killed your sister and didn't even know it. But I think that might have been hard for Tavor. She didn't quite live up to the standard of what maybe an adjunct should have in that situation. And then Felisin, who seems so mixed up with the whirlwind goddess and Shaik, all of that. It just, it's so heartbreaking. Her identity is still tied into her being a Malazan, as Karsa pointed out. And with that, she still remembers her brother, Ganos Paran. She still remembers her sister. And at the very end, right before she dies, she says, "But blood is the chain that can never break. And though we leave the house of our birth, it never leaves us." So the house of the birth is kind of its own house of chains. She later says, "But for me, the blood is heavy, so heavy. Tavor, it's all right. Blood, of course. This is how you break an unbreakable chain, by dying." She just wanted to know that her sister loved her. She didn't understand why she didn't. It's so heartbreaking when you see it from that perspective. Like, her identity still tied up in her blood, and that being its own chain. This leads us to the very last theme, which is betrayal and the related theme of vengeance. Of course, Shaik Felisin has so many betrayers in her camp, Corporal Dom and Bidithal, and Karsa is the one who responds with vengeance in the end. I thought it was interesting. I listened to the 10 Very Big Books podcast interview with Steven Erikson, in which he explains that this book is an exploration on cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is sometimes used by people to justify anything, saying that as long as it happens in a culture, we can't impose our own ideas of right and wrong on a culture. That's just one culture imposing on another. And while that may be slightly understandable, some horrific acts cannot be justified no matter what cultural tradition they're embedded in. An example of that is female mutilation, which is represented in this book through the character of Bidithal. This is not a justifiable act. Erikson explained that it just would have been a bad choice to have the Malazans be the ones to serve justice to Bidithal, that it had to be Karsa, it had to be someone within that tribesman culture. In addition to the acts of betrayal within Shaik's camp, we have the whirlwind goddess herself, who was betrayed by her husband, Onrak, for making love to another woman, Kilava. The whirlwind goddess states, "Vengeance was a beast long straining at its chains. Vengeance was all she had ever wanted. Vengeance was about to be unleashed, and even Raraku could not stop it." The whirlwind goddess was betrayed by Onrak, and her response to this was vengeance through clearing the bloodlines by killing off all the humans. She didn't care about anybody surviving. She was there for destruction. Lastly, the theme of betrayal is ultimately seen in Tavor killing her sister Felisin and not even knowing that she killed Felisin. For me, it was a little unclear whether Felisin knew that Tavor didn't know she was killing her or not. If you have any ideas about that, please let me know. I mean, it was clear to me that Tavor didn't know she killed Felisin, but whether Felisin knew that Tavor didn't know, that was unclear to me. I thought it was interesting, however, that Pearl and Lestara show up at that moment after that happened, because Lestara, earlier on in the book, describes her backstory as one of betrayal. When her parents neglect her, when the townspeople neglect her for that acolyte to kidnap her. So for her to be present at that moment with Pearl was very interesting, and it was an interesting choice that she and Pearl made without even looking at each other, not to tell Tavor the truth, but to say that Felisin died somewhere else. I understand that most people think that Lestara and Pearl were lying to Tavor as an act of compassion because it would ultimately destroy her to know that she killed her sister. But I couldn't help but question, even though this isn't as nice as the idea of compassion, I couldn't help but question whether both Pearl and Lestara, or even just one of them, was doing this not so much out of compassion, but for the Empire and for Lysine, because if they had told Tavor what she did, maybe that would weaken the adjunct and therefore weaken Lysine and the Empire. I don't know if that was the case at all, but it did cross my mind, so I thought I'd mention it. That concludes all of the themes as I saw them in the book. I know I didn't cover half the book or half of the amazing moments in this book, but those were the ones I really wanted to mention for the sake of time. I also had a couple of questions regarding Karsa, one being the beginning of the book with the Forcasol, having this prophecy that Karsa was a chosen one. She tells Byroth and Doloom that if you knew the horrible things that Karsa is going to do, you would kill him on the spot, but to guard him and guard him well, and there will come a time when I will come and get out of the way. I come and I bring peace. She seems to prophesize that Karsa is going to do something very important for everyone. So I think that hasn't played out yet, and I'm assuming that Karsa is going to have a very, very instrumental role in this entire series, Malazan Book of the Fallen. That's my prediction, but I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. Another question I had about Karsa was a scene with Lystara when she is reflecting on things that have happened and where she is now. She basically blames Karsa, that damned Tablakai and his wooden sword. If not for him, Thelasin wouldn't have crossed the 7 cities. Pormqual wouldn't have been a problem, and Coltane wouldn't have died. I wondered why she related all these events to Karsa or Tablakai. It's been a long time since I've read Dead House Gates, so unfortunately I don't remember Karsa Tablakai having that instrumental a role in that whole story, but I am very curious about it now. I really want to reread that book so I can see what Lystara is talking about and if it has merit. If there's something that I've missed that you think I should know, without, of course, spoilers for anything else in the series, please let me know in the comments. And if you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please leave a comment, like this if you liked it. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.